Greetings to all my tech heads out there in the KevTechify nation, and if you're new here, welcome. In this episode, we're going to look at static network address translation. We'll be discussing a static NAT scenario, configuring and analyzing static network address translation, and then finally, we're going to verify that static network address translation. This episode is part of my series on enterprise networking, security, and automation. I'm Kevin here at KevTechify. Let's get this adventure started. Static NAT is a one-to-one mapping. You have to remember that static NAT here is our one-to-one. One private IP address to one public IP address. Static NAT allows external devices to connect to internal devices using the statically assigned public IP address. One example here is you're going to run your own web server inside of your company. You're going to run that web server. You're going to give it an IP address on your local area network. It's going to have 192.168.10.254. So it's on the inside of your network. But people on the outside of your network from anywhere on the internet, you want them to have access because you want them to come to your website and give you money for whatever you're selling. And so you want to make sure people can do that. Now, because your web server has the 192.168.10.254 address, we have to translate that into something that we can get to on the internet. If that client puts in a 10 or 192 address in their web browser, a router is going to see that packet as the destination IP address, a private IP address, and it's going to discard that packet. That packet will never make it there. And what we have to do is this client has to put in a publicly accessible IP address. That is the IP address right here of this interface of serial 0111. Serial 011. And this IP address, that's what the client is going to put in its browser. And so it puts this 209.165.201.5 in its web browser. And that packet gets routed across the internet, bounces around, and it makes it to this interface. This interface has this IP address on it. The router, because you set up a static NAT, network address translation, when it gets in information destined to this 209.165.201.5 address, it has to translate that into an address on our network. And you set a translation up to point to the IP address right here of our 192.168.10.254. That is that static NAT. And static NAT's the only one that allows outside connections to start. Normally, all the other address translations start on the inside of your network and go out. This is the only one that can start on the outside and come in because it's that one-to-one static mapping. Now, to configure this static mapping, we have to use this command here. This command starts off with IPNAT because we are dealing with the IP suite here. We're looking at network address translation. And what we're going to say is the inside source address is a static address. So it's inside source static. Then we tell it what is the inside address. Well, the inside address is the 192.168.10.254. So that is the inside local address of our web server. And so this is of our internal web server. I'm going to make sure I put internal here. And then we map it to the inside global address of our internal web server. So this is the inside global. You map the inside local to the inside global. Once again, inside is the location. That web server is on the internal of our network. So it's both the inside and then where are we viewing it from. So from the inside of our local area network, this is the IP address, which we're going to map to. Everybody else on the outside of our network is going to see it as this IP address, which is technically the interface on the router on our edge. So once we set up this mapping, then we need to go in there and tell the router which is the inside interface, which is the outside interface. To go in here, we come in here, we do the interface serial 010. This has an IP address right here of our internal network, the 192.168, a private IP address. And so this is our inside address. So we start off saying IP NAT, because it's part of the IP suite. We're dealing with the NAT. And then because we're in the interface, we're going to say this is the inside interface. Once we set up the inside interface, then we need to say the outside interface. The outside interface, we go into the interface here of serial 0111. Look at the IP address. We set it up. That's at 209.165.200.1. If you like this episode on static network address translation and you get value out of it, and depending upon what platform you're using, please click that like button, give a 5-star rating, subscribe to my channel, leave a comment. Doing this supports the channel, which in turn helps me bring you more great content. You can also visit my website at KevTechify.com for all of my details and how to get these episodes in video and podcast form. Once we set up that IP address, then we can go and say this is the outside interface. So IP NAT outside. And what we've done now is we've set up the mapping saying going from this IP address is a static map to here. So we've mapped these two together, 192.168.10.254 to 209.165.201.5. We go into the interfaces themselves. Those interfaces are going to have different IP addresses, but it does give you a little bit of a clue here saying that this is on the inside of our network because it's a private IP address. So we set up IP NAT here, and then we go into the other interface. It's not the address here. So this is not that address. This is another address that's routed to on our interface, but this is the actual IP address here. So they route the traffic to here that's going to this address. When the router gets it in, it then forwards it. We set this as the outside address. So you set up the mapping, then you say, what's my inside interface? What's my outside interface? Let's take a look and analyze this static mapping we set up. The client starts over here. It sends a request. Sends this HTTP request. So a packet here, and so I want to make sure it says request. Sends that there. We route it to the IP address here. The router gets it in. It translates that from a public IP address to a private IP address so we can deliver it. So it does the translation as step number 2, translation. Then step 3 is we route it to its final destination. After we did our translation, the web server then generates a response, an HTTP response here. So this is the HTTP response. It generates that. It comes out. It hits our router. Our R2 receives that packet from the web server on its NAT inside interface, because this is the NAT inside interface, with the source address of the inside local address. Then it translates that, and so it translates the source address from 192 to the 209 address. It changes that source address so that way we can get routed across the internet, and finally then it gets delivered to the destination IP address. Verify our static NAT. We can issue the show IP NAT translations, and it'll give us all the translations. Here, this time when we ran our translation, this is just the mapping. And so we have the mapping, it's set up, it's ready to go. Now, when we reissue it again, we're going to get that same mapping here, which is the bottom one, but we're going to also show what the active session is right now. The active session will show this, plus it will show the outside IP addresses of where we are going to that outside device. So this is the active one. The dashes right here means this is the mapping. It's there. It's always going to be present in our translation tables. But when it becomes active, it now says we're doing TCP, and it'll show us the outside IP addresses. Another way to verify your static NAT is to use the show IP NAT statistics command. Here it'll give you the number of active translations. We have one active translation, and we can see that it's a static one, the one we just configured. It will also give us some configuration parameters. The configuration parameters gives us the outside and inside interfaces, which ones they're assigned to. And then we have hits and misses. The hits stand for every time we look through the network address translation and found a record, that's considered a hit. And then a miss is that we look through all the information on our network address translation, we didn't find any, and then we have to dynamically do an address translation. It was my pleasure to provide you with this wonderful episode on static network address translation. If you like this episode and you got value out of it, and of course, depending upon what platform you're using, please click that like button, give a 5-star rating, leave a comment. This all helps me bring you more great content. Please take a minute to subscribe to my channel. All my socials and contact information are on my website, KevTechify.com, and you can get all these episodes in video and podcast form. In the upper right is my playlist for my series on enterprise networking, security, and automation. In the bottom right is one of my favorite videos that I put there just for you. Thank you so much for watching this episode of my series on enterprise networking, security, and automation. Once again, I'm Kevin. This is KevTechify. I'll see you next time for another great adventure.